The galaxy was on the brink of war. For years, tensions between humans and the Zarathian Empire had been building, and now peace seemed impossible. Human diplomats had tried everything: treaties, talks, trade, but nothing worked. The Zarathians were a proud and powerful species, and they had no interest in sharing their resources or their territory. The humans were desperate, knowing that if the war started, it would be a battle they couldn't win in a last-ditch effort. The human government sent one of their best diplomats, John. He was no stranger to tough negotiations, but this time was different. The Zarathians had made a shocking demand. Peace could only be achieved through marriage. Specifically, John was to marry Mira, the daughter of the Zarathian emperor. It was a political move, nothing more, but it was their only hope for peace. John had heard of Mira before. She was beautiful, intelligent, and above all, powerful. As the princess of the Zarathian Empire, she held the future of her people in her hands. The marriage wasn't just a symbol, it was a political alliance that would tie the fates of both species together. John, however, couldn't help but feel a strange mix of unease and curiosity. He had always been committed to peace, but this felt different. He was being asked to sacrifice his personal life to secure the future of both races. Arriving at the Zarathian palace, John was greeted with cold, formal smiles. The grandeur of the palace was overwhelming. Tall, gleaming spires of silver and glass stretched into the sky, casting long shadows over the lush gardens below. The Zarathian people were proud, and everything in their palace reflected that pride. As he walked through the grand halls, John couldn't shake the feeling that he was an outsider in a world that was not his own. He was escorted to a large room where Mira would meet him. She stood by a window, gazing out at the distant stars. Her long, dark hair flowed like silk, and her sharp features made her look both regal and intimidating. She turned when she heard John enter, her piercing blue eyes studying him carefully. John took a deep breath. "Your Highness," he said, bowing slightly. Mira didn't respond immediately. She looked him over, her eyes scanning him as if he were a mere tool for her people's survival. "I hope you understand the gravity of what you're about to do, human," she said, her voice cold but not unkind. "This marriage is not just for our benefit. It is for the future of our people." John nodded, trying to mask his nervousness. "I understand," he said. "But this is also for peace." "Right." Mira gave a small, humorless smile. "Peace is what we all want. But make no mistake, it is my people's future that matters. Yours is secondary." John couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration, but he kept his thoughts to himself. The Zarathians had always been a proud and calculated race, and it was clear that Mira was no exception. She was a leader. She carried the weight of her people's expectations on her shoulders. The two of them sat across from each other, and Mira began explaining the terms of their union. John listened closely, his mind racing with the implications. Of everything she said, the marriage would unite their two species, creating an unbreakable bond. But the marriage itself would also be symbolic. For the Zarathians, it was a way to demonstrate their strength and superiority. For the humans, it was their last hope of avoiding war. After a long conversation, John stood up, ready to leave. He had many questions, but it was clear that Mira had made up her mind. This was going to happen whether he liked it or not. As he turned to leave, Mira spoke again. "There is one condition," she said, her tone suddenly softer. John paused and turned back to face her. "What condition?" Mira's gaze softened slightly, though she still held her regal composure. "The wedding night is off limits, will not be expected to perform any duties beyond what is necessary for peace." John blinked, surprised. By her words, he had expected something along these lines. After all, this was a marriage of convenience, not love. But hearing it from Mira herself was something else entirely. "I understand," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. She gave him a small nod, but there was no warmth in it. "Good, I hope you will remember your place, human. You do this for peace, not for pleasure." As John left the room, he couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and disappointment. The marriage would go ahead as planned, but it was clear that Mira had no intention of letting it become anything more than a political arrangement. Still, John couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye in the days that followed. John met with the Zarathian leaders to finalize the details of the treaty. The discussions were long and difficult, with little room for compromise. But the humans knew this was their only chance. If they didn't succeed now, the galaxy would burn. John couldn't help but wonder how he would navigate his marriage to Mira. Was there a way to make this work? Could they find common ground, despite the distance between their cultures? And more importantly, could they stop a war without losing everything in the process? As the day of the wedding approached, John prepared himself for the life he had never asked for. He wasn't just marrying a princess, he was marrying the future of an entire species. And though it wasn't the life he had envisioned, it was the life he had to accept. For the sake of peace, he would do what was necessary. But as he looked out at the stars, he couldn't help but wonder, could this marriage lead to more than just an end to the war? Could it lead to something deeper? The day of the wedding arrived quickly, and John felt the weight of the situation more than ever. The Zarathian palace was filled with grandeur, but it felt more like a prison to him. He had been prepared for a political event, but nothing could have prepared him for the overwhelming scale of the ceremony. It was like something out of a dream. Massive hall, towering columns of silver and blue, and the sound of distant music filling the air. John tried to calm his nerves as he stood in front of the grand mirror in his chambers, adjusting his formal attire. He was dressed in the finest human clothes, tailored to look dignified and powerful, but the outfit seemed out of place on him. He wasn't used to such extravagance. His role today was more than just a political move. It was about history. The peace treaty would hinge on this moment, on this union. But for John, it was hard to see anything beyond the pressure. As he waited, he couldn't help but think about Mira. He hadn't seen her since their conversation the other day. He still remembered her cold gaze, the way she had spoken about their marriage, almost like it was just another task to complete. The idea of marrying someone without love was strange to him, yet he couldn't deny the power that Mira held. She was a symbol of strength and leadership. Still, that didn't make him feel any less nervous. He was escorted to the grand hall, where the Zarathian nobles and dignitaries had already gathered. The room was filled with thousands of people, all waiting for the ceremony to begin. John couldn't help but feel small in the face of all the grandeur. The walls were lined with gleaming holographic portraits of past emperors and queens. The air smelled of roses, and the soft hum of soft-spoken voices filled the room as guests exchanged. Whispers then, the doors at the far end of the hall opened and Mira entered. She was everything John had expected, and more. Dressed in an elaborate gown made of shimmering materials, Mira moved with a grace that took everyone's breath away. Her dark hair was styled in intricate braids, her pale skin glowing under the lights. But it wasn't her beauty that left him speechless. It was the way she held herself, the air of authority that surrounded her. She was more than a princess. She was a leader. The guests fell silent as Mira walked down the aisle, her eyes focused ahead. She didn't look at John as she passed him, but John felt her presence like a force. He wasn't sure if it was respect or fear that held him in place, but he felt both. When she reached the altar, she turned to face him. Myra's gaze was still cool, almost distant, but John could see the flicker of something behind her eyes. It was a fleeting emotion, something John couldn't name, but it was there. She didn't want this marriage any more than he did, but she knew it had to happen. The ceremony began, and John followed Myra's lead as they exchanged vows. His words were simple and sincere, though he didn't truly know what he was promising. He spoke of peace, of working together for a better future. But was he promising anything else? Wasn't sure. He was just going through the motions, doing what was required of him. Myra's vows were far more formal. She spoke of her duty to her people, of the sacrifices she was willing to make to ensure the survival of her empire. Her voice was steady, but there was no warmth in it. This wasn't a marriage of love, it was a marriage of necessity. Her words were meant to assure her people that their future was safe. She would do her part, and so would John. As the ceremony continued, John couldn't. help but feel the tension between them. They stood side by side, but it felt like an invisible wall was between them. He could feel Myra's presence, but she seemed so far away, locked in her own world of duty and responsibility. He wished there could be more to this, some hint of affection, some acknowledgement that they were in this together, but that wasn't the way it worked. They were not here for personal reasons. They were here to secure peace, to prevent a war. And that was enough. At least that's what John kept telling himself. Finally, the ceremony reached its conclusion. The officiant declared them husband and wife, and the room erupted in applause. But John barely heard it. His mind was still processing everything. He had married a woman he barely knew, a woman who had made it clear that their union was nothing more than a political tool. Mira turned to him then, her face unreadable. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and John felt a strange pull, something he hadn't expected. He couldn't be sure, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Regret? Hope? He wasn't sure. But before he could say anything, she turned away, leading him down the aisle as the crowd cheered. As they walked side by side, John's thoughts raced. Could this marriage ever become something more than just a treaty? Would Myra ever see him as more than just a pawn in her people's game? The question lingered in his mind as they exited the grand hall, leaving behind the echoes of celebration. That night, they would return to the palace as husband and wife, but it was clear that the path ahead was still uncertain. The treaty was in place, but the real challenges had just begun. Would Mira and John find a way to make this work? Or would they remain strangers in a marriage forged for the sake of peace? As John looked at Mira, walking ahead of him, he realized that the journey had only just begun. The days after the wedding passed in a blur of meetings, formalities, and quiet tension. John had expected the palace to feel more like a prison, and he wasn't wrong. The Zarathian palace was both beautiful and intimidating, with tall, reflective walls and massive corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. The hum of life within. The palace was constant, but the silence between him and Mira was just as loud. Their first days as a married couple were more like an extended negotiation than anything resembling a partnership. John had hoped that there might be some moment, some flicker of kindness or understanding between them, but Mira remained distant. The wedding had been a formal event. It seemed that everything about their marriage would be the same. Cold. Calculated and entirely for political reasons. John spent his days in meetings with the Zarathian Council, discussing the terms of the peace treaty. The discussions were tedious and full of long speeches and numbers, but John knew they were necessary. If the treaty wasn't finalized, both sides would risk plunging into war. He had always been good at keeping his emotions in check, but the tension in the air was undeniable. He couldn't help but feel like a pawn in a game he hadn't fully understood when he'd agreed to marry Mira. At night, he would return to the palace suite that he now shared with Mira. The room was elegant, filled with dark woods and golden accents. It was beautiful, but it felt empty. There were two large beds, each a symbol of their separate worlds. As a married couple, they should have been sharing a space, but Myra made it clear from the beginning that they would keep things separate, physically at least. John had expected this. Mira had told him flatly that their marriage wasn't about love or intimacy. It was about peace. Still, something in him longed for Moran understanding, a connection. He had hoped that over time their forced partnership would become something more, but the silence between them spoke volumes. One evening, after another long day of meetings, John returned to their suite. Mira was sitting by the large window, staring out at the sprawling gardens below. She looked so serene, but there was an underlying sadness in her posture that John couldn't ignore. "Mira," he called softly, stepping into the room. "We need to talk." She didn't turn to look at him, but her voice was calm. "About what, John?" He took a deep breath, unsure of where to start. "About this, ... about us." He gestured between them. "I thought maybe, after everything that's happened, we could try to make this work. As a team, we're married, and we're going to have to work together for peace, so why not try to understand each other?" Mira was quiet for a long moment, her gaze still fixed on the view outside. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "I've told you before, John, this marriage was never about us. It was never meant to bring us closer. It's about our people. It's about the peace between our worlds." John walked over to her, standing a few feet behind her. "I know that, but we can't keep living like this. I'm not asking for anything more than a conversation. I want to understand you, Mira. I want to know the person I'm supposed to share this. ... This partnership with. Don't you think we owe each other that much?" She turned to face him then, her expression still unreadable. "I don't want to get close to you, John," she said firmly. "Can't afford to. This marriage is a tool, that's all it is. If I let myself get close to you, I might lose sight of what's important, my duty to my people, my responsibility to my empire." John nodded slowly, feeling a pang of sadness. He had known this was coming, but that didn't mean it hurt any less. "I understand that," he said quietly. "But we're going to have to spend a lot of time together, whether you like it or not. I just think that if we're going to make this work, we need to at least try to understand each other." Myra's gaze softened for just a moment, but it was quickly replaced by the hard determination that had defined her since the beginning. "You don't understand, John. I can't let myself be distracted by anything else. My people's future depends on this marriage. If I start thinking of you as more than just a political tool, I might lose my way, and I can't afford that." John sighed, feeling the weight of her words. "I get it. I do. But just remember, I'm here to help. I'm not your enemy. We're on the same side." For a brief moment, Mira's eyes flickered with something resembling doubt, but she quickly turned away. "I'll try to keep that in mind," she said softly. John knew that was as much as he would get from her. He had tried, and yet something in him couldn't let go of the hope that maybe one day they could find common ground. Even though they were trapped in a marriage of convenience, he believed there was more to their relationship than Myra was willing to admit. As the days turned into weeks, John found himself becoming more involved in the Zarathian culture. Began attending social events with Mira, sitting in on meetings with her leaders, and trying to understand what made her people tick. Mira remained distant, but there were small moments when their eyes would meet, and for just a second, John would see a flicker of something more. They were both just trying to survive. John understood that. But he couldn't help wondering if they could survive together, not just as political allies, but as something more. But for now, all he could do was wait. Wait for the treaty to be finalized. Wait for peace. And maybe, just maybe, wait for Mira to see him as more than just a human pawn in a game of power. The days continued to pass with the same quiet tension that had marked John and Mira's marriage from the beginning. Their lives were filled with endless meetings, discussions about the treaty, and diplomatic visits. They were always together, yet still seemed like strangers. Mira's coldness remained, and John found himself struggling to bridge the gap between them. She had made it clear that their marriage was for peace and nothing more. But despite her walls, John couldn't help but wonder if there was more to their union than she was willing to admit. It was one evening, after a long day of negotiations, when things began to shift. Mira was seated at her desk, reviewing reports from the council. Her face was unreadable, her expression as composed as ever, but John noticed the tiredness in her eyes. It was the first time he had seen her look this way. Normally she exuded confidence and strength, but tonight there was something different, something vulnerable. John hesitated before approaching her. "Mira," he called softly. She looked up, her expression neutral. "What is it, John?" He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. It wasn't like him to open up, especially not about something as personal as this. But something about the way she looked tonight made him want to try. "I've been thinking," he began carefully. "I know this marriage is about the treaty, about peace, ... But we've been living like strangers, like we're just two people forced into a room together. And I don't want that, not anymore." Mira's gaze remained fixed on him, but she didn't respond immediately. Her fingers rested lightly on the papers in front of her, as if waiting for him to continue. I understand your duty to your people, John continued. I do. But I also think there's more to us than just politics. I don't want to spend the rest of my life with you as a stranger. For the first time, Myra's face softened. She set the papers down and folded her hands in her lap. You don't understand, John, she said, her voice quieter now. I can't let myself get close to you. If I do, ... If I start caring for you, ... I might lose everything. My people, my responsibilities, they come first. Always. John felt a pang in his chest. He had known this. He had known that Myra's heart was bound by duty, by the weight of her responsibilities. But hearing her say it so plainly hurt more than he expected. I don't want to take away from your duty, he said quietly. But we're not enemies, Mira. I'm here to help. I'm here because I want to see us both succeed, not just in politics, but in life. I don't want to be just a tool for peace. I want to be your partner, even if it's just in the small things. Myra didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood up and walked over to the window, gazing out at the view of the city below. The lights of the Zarathian capital glittered in the distance, a reminder of the empire she was meant to protect. John could see the weight of her thoughts in the way she stood, her shoulders stiff and her jaw set. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I never asked for any of this. I didn't ask to be the one who carries the future of my people on her shoulders. I didn't ask for a marriage like this. She turned to face him, her eyes full of a deep, unspoken sadness. But here we are, and I have no choice but to follow through. For my people. John took a step closer, his heart heavy with empathy. I don't think you should have to do this alone, Mira. You don't have to carry all of this on your shoulders, not when there's someone willing to help. For the first time, Mira looked at him with something that wasn't coldness or duty. It was a look of uncertainty, a crack in her carefully constructed walls. John could see it, just a glimmer of something more. In that moment, he knew that there was still hope for their relationship, even if it was just the tiniest spark. I don't know how to trust anyone, John, she admitted. I've been trained to lead, to make decisions without emotion. But when you asked me to trust you, I realized that maybe I've been wrong. Maybe I've been shutting out the one person who could help me the most. John stepped forward, his voice gentle. You don't have to trust me all at once. We can take it slow, Mira. You don't have to give up everything you've built for yourself. But maybe we can try something different. We can start with small steps, as partners, and see where it leads. Mira stood there, staring at him for a long time. John held his breath, waiting for her to say anything. Finally, she nodded, though it was tentative, almost hesitant. I'll try, she said quietly. John smiled, a small but genuine smile. It wasn't much, but it was something. That's all I asked for. For the first time in their marriage, there was a sense of possibility in the air. It wasn't a magical transformation. It wasn't some grand, sweeping change. But in that moment, they had taken the first step towards something real, a partnership built not on politics or duty, but on understanding. John knew that there was still much to be done. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, but for the first time he felt like they were facing those challenges together. And that was enough for now. As the night stretched on, and the stars twinkled above, John and Myra stood together in the quiet of the palace. Two people who had started as strangers but were now slowly becoming something more. The treaty had been signed, and peace was still hanging by a thin thread. John and Mira had managed to hold off war, but tensions between the human colonies and the Zarathian Empire remained high. Despite their efforts, it seemed like peace was always just out of reach. Days turned into weeks, and the burden of the treaty weighed heavily on them both. John continued to work tirelessly on the negotiations, hoping that the deal could hold long enough to stop the violence. But every day something new seemed to threaten the fragile peace. A new skirmish, a new misunderstanding, a new attack. The work was never-ending, and John couldn't help but wonder if they would ever truly succeed. Mira. on the other hand, was trying to manage her own people's expectations. As the princess of the Zarathian Empire, she had to maintain a strong front. Her people had grown up with the belief that they were superior. To marry a human, especially one so much lower in rank, was a huge sacrifice for her. But she was doing it for peace, for the future of her empire. She reminded herself of that every time she saw John. It was all for her people, yet, despite the political nature of their marriage, Mira had started to feel something more. The walls she had built around her heart were slowly starting to crumble. When John had first arrived, she had seen him as nothing more than a tool and instrument to secure peace. But now, as they worked together day after day, she couldn't deny that there was something more between them. It was different from the other men she had known. His kindness, his quiet strength, it made her see him in a new light. Still, she wasn't sure she could allow herself to truly feel for him. It was too dangerous. Her duty to her people came first. Always, one evening John and Mira were reviewing a new report when the news arrived. The situation on the border had taken a turn for the worse. A small human colony had been attacked by an extremist faction from the Zarathian military. The report was full of alarming details: civilian casualties, burned villages, and stolen resources. John slammed his fist against the table, his frustration evident. "This is exactly what we've been trying to avoid," he exclaimed, standing up. "How can we make peace when things like this keep happening?" Mira's face was unreadable, but her eyes were dark with concern. "We've been trying to stop this," she said quietly, her voice steady but with an edge of frustration. "But some factions within the Empire refuse to accept the peace. They want war. They think we are weak for making this alliance." John paced back and forth, the weight of the situation pressing on him. "What are we supposed to do, Mira? Can't keep putting out fires like this. We need a solution, and fast, or we're going to lose everything." Mira stood up as well, her own anger simmering beneath the surface. "You think I don't know that?" she snapped, her tone sharper than usual. "I am the one who is responsible for this empire. I am the one who has to answer for every action, every mistake. I am the one who has to live with the consequences." John turned to face her, his expression softening. "I didn't mean to imply that you weren't doing enough. I just... I don't know what else we can do." Myra's face softened slightly, but her eyes were still filled with worry. "We keep moving forward," she said, her voice quieter now. "We keep trying, keep working. We can't give up. Not now." John nodded, but his mind was racing. They were so close, yet so far. If they couldn't stop these attacks, all their work, all their sacrifices would have been for nothing. And the war that they had fought so hard to prevent would become inevitable. As they continued to discuss the situation, Mira's mind kept returning to the thought that had been growing in her for days. Maybe, just maybe, John wasn't just her political partner. Maybe there was more to their relationship than she had ever allowed herself to believe. But before she could think further, the room's door suddenly opened, and one of the royal advisors stepped inside. His face was grim, and he didn't wait for permission before speaking. "Your Highness," he said, "there's been another attack. The human fleet has moved into Zarathian-controlled space. It seems they're preparing for retaliation." Myra's heart skipped a beat. This was worse than she had feared. If the humans had entered their space, there would be no way to avoid war now. The delicate peace that John and she had worked so hard to build was crumbling faster than she could keep up with. John looked at Myra, his expression serious. "We need to act now, before things get worse." Mira nodded, her mind already working. Through their options, she could feel the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her, but she wasn't about to let everything fall apart now. They had to stop this whatever it took. Together, they quickly began to formulate a plan. They would need to negotiate with the human leaders, but they couldn't afford to show weakness. Mira knew that her people wouldn't accept any further delay in action. The extremist factions would only grow stronger, and the war would be impossible to stop. After a long night of planning, they sent a message to the human fleet, requesting an urgent meeting. Mira knew it was a gamble, but it was the only chance they had left. They had to find a way to stop the war before it was too late. Next morning, John and Mira stood together in the palace's grand hall, awaiting the response from the human fleet. Mira's heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel John's anxiety mirroring her own. They had done everything they could. Now it was up to the humans to decide if peace was truly possible. As they waited, Mira couldn't help but think. Back to all the moments they had shared, the quiet conversations, small glances, the understanding that had begun to form between them. Could it be enough to stop the war? Could they truly save both their people? As the message finally came through, Myra's breath caught in her throat. The humans were willing to meet, but time was running out. The next few days passed in a blur of strategy meetings, urgent messages, and tense negotiations. The human fleet had agreed to meet with Mira and John, but the clock was ticking. Tensions between the two species had reached a boiling point, and it felt like the fragile peace they had worked so hard to build was about to collapse. John and Mira sat together late into the night, poring over the information they had received from both sides. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the palace's air systems. John could see the exhaustion on Mira's face, the way her eyes had grown tired from the endless discussions and pressure. He couldn't help but feel a growing respect for her. The weight of her responsibility was immense, and yet she carried it with a calm determination that impressed him more every day. Mira looked up from the reports, meeting John's gaze for the first time in what felt like hours. "I'm not sure we can hold this off any longer, John," she said, her voice low but firm. "The humans are demanding more than we can give. They want assurances that we will disarm, that we will submit to their control. They don't trust us, and with good reason. We've fought wars for centuries." John leaned forward, rode his brow furrowed in thought. "I know, but we can't let it escalate. We can't let this turn into an all-out war. We'll lose everything, both our people, our cultures, everything." Myra's gaze softened slightly. "You've been saying that for weeks, John, but the reality is, we're not in control anymore. Some factions within my empire want war. They think it will give them power, that it will strengthen us. They don't see the bigger picture, don't see what this could do to our future." John's heart sank as he realized the truth in her words. He had always known that peace was fragile, but hearing it from Myra, someone who had been raised to fight for her people, made the danger all too real. He could see that Mira was torn, caught between her duty to her empire and the growing connection she felt to him. "Then we have to stop them," John said urgently. "We have to stop the extremists before they tear everything apart."
Myra
nodded, but there was a sadness in her eyes that John couldn't ignore. "I can't do it alone, John. I need your help. Can't make this decision without you." John's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment. He had spent so much time hoping for this, hoping that they could work together, not just as political allies, but as true partners. And now, it was happening. Mira, the leader of her people, was asking for his help. Not just as a diplomat, but as someone she trusted. "I'm with you," John said, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes. We'll stop them, together." Mira's eyes softened, and for the first time, John saw a flicker of something more, something beyond duty. Beyond the political games they had been playing, he saw the person behind the crown, the woman who had been forced into this life of responsibility and sacrifice. And in that moment, he realized that they had both been trapped by their roles, but they were no longer bound by those roles, had become something more. Over the next few days, John and Mira worked tirelessly to prepare for the final confrontation. They contacted key leaders in the Zarathian military, those who still believed in peace, and convinced them to take action. They sent messages to the human fleet, urging them to hold off their attacks, promising that peace was still possible if they could get the extremists under control. But it wasn't easy. Every step forward seemed to be met with resistance, and every plan they put into motion felt like it was one step away from failure. John could see the strain on Mira's face. She was fighting against centuries of tradition, against a system that valued power over peace. But she was determined, and John admired her for it. Finally, the day came when they would have to act. The human fleet was advancing, and the Zarathian military had mobilized. The countdown had begun. John and Mira stood in the command room of the palace, looking out at the stars. The weight of their decision hung heavy in the air. It was now or never. Mira turned to John, her expression more serious than ever. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. John nodded, his resolve firm. "Yes, I know it's at stake. But we're not going to let this turn into a war. We'll stop it." Together, they sent out one final message to the human fleet, offering peace, offering a solution. It wasn't easy, and there was no guarantee that it would work. But it was their last chance. The response came quickly, and it was clear that the humans were just as desperate to avoid war. They agreed to a ceasefire, and the two sides began to talk. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. The extremists within the Zarathian military were removed from power, and a new, more peaceful leadership emerged. For the first time, John and Mira saw the light at the end of the tunnel. Peace was within reach, and though the road ahead would be long and difficult, they had done it. Together, as they stood side by side, looking out at the stars, John turned to Mira. "We did it," he said quietly. Mira looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "Yes, we did." John smiled, his heart swelling with pride. They had faced impossible odds, but they had succeeded. And, for the first time, he realized that their partnership was about more than just politics. They had found something real, something that would carry them forward, and, perhaps, it was only the beginning. The peace treaty had been signed. The extremists removed, and the human fleet had returned to their space. Mira and John stood on the balcony of the palace, looking out at the quiet city below. The once tense atmosphere had shifted. Now, a sense of hope filled the air. It was the first time in weeks that Mira could allow herself to feel like she was finally free. The weight of the treaty, the responsibility of the empire, and the pressure of the marriage had all been crushing her. Not now, it felt different. There was a sense of peace that had never been there before. John stood beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon. The stars were bright, more vibrant than ever. The calmness in the air was a welcome change after the storm that had threatened to tear everything apart. He couldn't help but smile as he glanced at Mira. She was different, now softer, more open. It was as if the walls she had built around herself had finally started to crumble. "I never thought we'd get here," Mira said, her voice quiet but full of emotion. "I never thought it was possible, but somehow, we did it." At her, his gaze steady. "You did it," he said softly. He held it all together. "I was just here to help, to stand by your side." Mira turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "You didn't just help. You were the reason we succeeded. You gave me the strength to keep going. Without you, I would have fallen apart." John smiled at her words, but he could see the genuine gratitude in her eyes. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his voice warm. "I think we both proved that, you by leading your people, and me by sticking with you, even when it seemed like everything was falling apart." Mira's gaze softened, and for the first time, John saw her smile, real smile, one that lit up her face. It was a smile that spoke of relief, of something more than duty, something real. "I'm starting to think that maybe, just maybe, this marriage was more than just politics," Mira said, her tone light but full of meaning. "I was so focused on my duty, on keeping the empire together, that I didn't realize how much I needed you, how much we needed each other." John's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when Mira saw him not just as a tool for peace, but as someone who could stand beside her as an equal. They were no longer just two people trapped in a political marriage. They had become partners in every sense of the word. "I've always believed in you, Mira," John said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I know it wasn't easy, and I know you've had to make difficult choices. But through it all, you never lost sight of what mattered most: your people. You led them with courage, even when it meant sacrificing your own happiness. I admire that more than you know." Mira's eyes shone with something more than just gratitude. It was a deeper emotion, one that spoke of a growing connection between them. I'm starting to realize that maybe it wasn't just the Empire that needed saving. Maybe I needed saving too. John took a step closer to her, his voice softening. You never needed saving, Mira. You just needed someone to stand by you, someone who would support you no matter what. She looked at him for a long moment as if weighing his words. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. The tension that had been between them for so long began to dissolve, replaced by something new. Something they had both been searching for. John, Mira said quietly, I never expected this. I never expected us to be more than just a marriage of convenience. But now, I'm starting to see that maybe there's more to this than we thought. John's heart swelled as he looked at her. I've always hoped for more, he admitted, but I didn't want to push you. I didn't want to make this harder than it already was. Mira smiled again, her fingers gently tightening around his. We've been through so much together, John. And now, I think it's time we finally started living for ourselves. Not for the Empire. Not for peace. But for us. John's heart raced as he took a step closer, the space between them almost gone. I agree. It's time for a new beginning for both of us. They stood there for a moment, the sound of the city below fading into the background. The stars above seemed to shine brighter now, a symbol of the hope they had fought so hard to achieve. Mira and John were no longer just two strangers, forced together by circumstance. They had become something more. They'd become partners. In every sense of the word, Mira looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. What now? She asked, her voice soft. John smiled, his grip on her hand tightening. Now we take it one step at a time, together. And with that, the two of them stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but they knew they could face it together. They had found something real, something that went beyond politics, beyond duty. They had found each other.